This program is made possible by grants from ARCO, Atlantic Richfield Company, putting our energy into America, and by the Masco Corporation.
An artist's studio, a place of intensive creativity, energy, and self-imposed loneliness, a place where an artist may literally spend years by himself. Hello, I'm Dustin Hoffman, and this is Willem de Kooning's studio on Long Island, not far from New York City. In fact, that's his chair that he sits in when he's contemplating the work you see. De Kooning is the only surviving member of a remarkable group of artists that came together in New York's Greenwich Village during the Depression. The pioneers of modern American art, Willem de Kooning, Jackson Pollock, Arshile Gorky, Franz Klein, and David Smith. They are abstract expressionists. What's that mean? Well, it's a label. Impressionist is another. I don't know that much about art, but I learned that the difference between the two is that Impressionists, like Claude Monet, broke up light and used its many parts to paint the life they saw around them. Expressionists paint their own inner feelings. Their art lacks familiar landmarks. It is abstract, and it can be very intimidating. But if you can get past that initial reaction, it's really a very personal kind of art. It invites a viewer to feel a painting emotionally rather than just to look at it. In this series, we are going to look behind the art of these five expressionists. Jackson Pollock, the first we will look at, was initially the most controversial. He said that he painted unconsciously and he couldn't explain his work. To try to do so would destroy it. Pollock's paintings were explosive stretches of canvas. His art came from an inner world and he tried to express the energy of that world. Spontaneous, tangled, violent are some of the words critics use to describe his work. How do you look at paintings that seem to bear no relation to anything? Pollock hoped that his viewers wouldn't look for familiar landmarks, that they would respond freely and let the paintings float into their minds.
Pollock's painting, when it first appeared, looked like it came out of left field. Today, and the Beaubourg show of 1982 is the symbol of this, there is a general recognition of Pollock as the great painter of the middle of the 20th century. Remember that Paris had been the bastion of everything that rejected abstract expressionism and Pollock in particular. So the closing of the circle. that this show represents is symbolic of Pollock's acceptance on a worldwide level as a great master. He's the symbol of a whole generation of great painters, something that I like to refer to as the American Renaissance.
It goes all the way from the work of Jackson Pollock to the extraordinarily spacious work of Gorky, to the amazingly expressive work of de Kooning, and the powerful calligraphy of Franz Klein. What was happening, in other words, was not the insistence on one idea, but rather a wide front of ways of invading the unknown was being explored.
Well, anybody who's an original painter is something new. I mean, he was Jackson. It was a new. I sensed it that first day with the notebooks of imagery that were not like anything I'd ever seen.
He made you feel that it was possible to break new ground by dealing with another subject, which was the self rather than the nature outside or a subject outside of you. The subject was within you.
I would say at that time that an artist could say he was an American and people wouldn't look twice at it and say, what? How can an American be an artist? That was how bad the period was.
There was this ferment of art activity, creativity of a new kind of painting that was what we called abstract expressionism. But the artists were all seeing each other here at the Cedar Tavern. And it was a community of artists. And you felt very comfortable in it because you were coming from your studio, they were coming from their studios, and they discussed painting. It was always talking about painting.
Everybody was poor. Nobody was successful. People didn't have galleries, and people talked about painting, painters, all through history. I mean, it was endless talk about painting. It was marvelous.
The spirit of the place fed you. It gave you a certain kind of nourishment to go back with enthusiasm into your studio.
And don't forget that at that period, when the American painter was just beginning to raise his head in the community, it came right after a period in which France had given the world such great artists, from Picasso to Matisse to Mural. Jackson knew that he had to say his own thing. He could not just be happy to follow the tradition and the path of what they've laid.
I grew up in the country, real country. Wyoming, Arizona, northern and southern California. I was born in Wyoming. My father had a farm in Cody.
The family had no money. The farms his father tried to manage failed. By the age of 10, Pollock had lived in 6 different places in 3 states. At 15, Jackson and his brother Sandy worked on a surveying gang all summer, building the new road around the north rim of the Grand Canyon.
I have a definite feeling for the West. The vast horizontality of the land, for instance. Some people find references to American Indian art and calligraphy in parts of my pictures. That wasn't intentional. Probably was a result of early memories and enthusiasms. Although I feel I will make an artist of some kind, I've never proven to myself, nor anybody else, that I have it in me. People have always frightened and bored me. Consequently, I have been within my own shell. In 1930, Pollock, then 18, joined his older brothers in New York. I spent 2 years at the Art Students League.
Well, I think that the League had a reputation of being very free. There were no rules. There were no constraints of any sort. People came, and it was their responsibility to work and to learn. And I don't know of any other school at the time that had that kind of freedom.
Tom Benton was teaching there then, and he did a lot for me. He gave me the only formal instruction I ever had. He introduced me to Renaissance art, and he got me a job in the League cafeteria.
This studio is probably just exactly the spot where he used to teach. And I see him now as a short, cocky little man with a dark mustache. I remember he represented the indigenous American thing against the fashionable, effete, to him, effete, sissy Paris school and so on. And he, more rugged the better. And I learned how to roll cigarettes and smoke Bull Durham. And Pollock then was a monitor. And Monday mornings, he'd tell the model how to go and pose and so on. And he'd mark the chalk, so from then on, during the week, she'd have the same pose. Benton was a big muscle man and bone man, for anatomy. And I remember, my memory of Pollock also is going up and showing people, the deltoid goes here, he's saying the models are a little squeamish or ticklish sometimes, but nevertheless it showed where the thing worked and tactile quality of the model. I don't know whether the models would allow that today or not. I remember also one time going with Pollock along 14th Street, and I remember going across the street where Pollock went into the bank and went up and down the counter to pick up the slips, deposit slip and so on, because the opposite side was blank and that was a way to get drawing paper for his sketching. And he used to sketch with a lot of energy and enthusiasm.
Throughout his late teens and 20s, Pollock took sketching trips cross-country, riding the rails, hitching, and by car. Most of this early work he destroyed.
Benton not only encouraged students to take a trip across the country, but they were going home and had to cross the country in order to get home. Pollock and his older brother Charles invited me to go along. He said, "You want to come out and contribute toward the expense of the trip?" And it's going to be something like $25 or $30 or something like that. But it was a wonderful opportunity, and he had never been west of Geneva, New York at that time, I think. And then the Southwest and the desert and the canyon and the colored clays and everything was so exciting. And so Pollock and I would get our sketch pads and make sure we're getting the right thing.
The country began getting interesting in Kansas. The wheat was just beginning to turn, and the farmers were making preparation for harvest.
We camped out sometimes. I remember sleeping in the cold, cold desert and maybe seeing a snake or two crawl around, which is also different, and then waking up in the sun, hitting it in the eyes in the morning. And I remember they had this box of colored hard crayons, which had to be put in water. And water being hard to come by in the desert, he would spit on it. But he spit, and with a great intensity, as always, but he spit on them to loosen the watercolor and become like liquid watercolor. And during the desert scene, or the cactus, or the sun behind, and so on, put it down with great physical energy on the paper, which is, of course, later I realized is the direction he was already headed.
I'm damn grateful to Tom. He drove his kind of realism at me so hard I bounced right into non-objective painting. also grateful to the WPA for keeping me alive during the 30s.
It provided us with a financial base of some sort. It provided us with a way of utilizing what we had studied in school. And we became practicing artists. We also got involved with the Sequeiros workshop. This was sometime in the middle 30s. Roscoe came to New York, Rivera came to New York, Sequeiros came to New York. They represented a tremendous birth of art and social consciousness that had developed in Mexico, and they brought it like messengers from Mexico. The things that we did in the Sequeiros workshop were essentially floats, very large banners, picket signs, multi-reproduced picket signs. Sequeiros was the one who really got fantastically curious about all of this material, and he saw this as a potent future for the new artist. Pollock and a number of people were the core of this group. The spattering and the pouring were a direct result of his experience in the workshop.
Jackson Pollock was a very talented young man that can make everything that he wants. He makes a very good realism and after very good abstractionism also.
When the WPA art program shut down, Pollock found work decorating ties and lipsticks.
New York, 1937. Dear Mother, Jack has been having a very difficult time with himself. This past year has been a succession of periods of emotional instability for him, accompanied, of course, with drinking.
Well, he had one kind of energy that was destructive, that was like a compulsion that would recur, especially if he were drinking. I guess only when he was drinking. When he wasn't, it didn't come out. And that was rather scary because he would seem to have to make some kind of a destructive gesture every little while. Like if we were walking along the street, he'd pull up a shrub in front of a building, or at the house he would twist my dog's ears. Things like that he just seemed compelled to do.
I haven't much to say about my work and things. Only that I've been going through violent changes the past couple of years. God knows what'll come out of it all. It's pretty negative stuff so far.
In the late 30s, Pollock sought the psychiatric help which continued the rest of his life.
He was a man who was tortured by something, I don't know what.
Jackson was a person that was not verbal. He wasn't, he didn't talk much. You sensed an intensity and a quietness in him. But at the same time, you felt that he was observing you.
And at that point, I knew, let's say, Gorky, de Kooning. Don't know Pollock yet, so that more or less tells us. And shortly after that visit of Graham to my studio, I received a penny postcard from him in which he says he's arranging a show of French and American painting with names like Matisse, these masters' names, and he was inviting, I believe, 3 or 4 at most Americans. and he'd like to include me. Well, needless to say, this was big-time stuff. I was overwhelmed. Then my next piece of curiosity was, who were the other Americans? Someone called Jackson Pollock is one of them. Never heard the name, had no idea what he did. And de Kooning was one of them. Well, de Kooning I knew, so that was that. But who was this Jackson Pollock? He was 1 block away from me on 8th between University and Broadway. I promptly hoofed over there. It was a 5 flights up affair. And I tried the door, and someone opened it, and that was Jackson Pollock. And I said, I'm in the Graham show. So we introduced ourselves. This was his studio I walked into, and he said, come in. And I certainly did, and I saw what was around the room. I felt the presence of a living force that I hadn't witnessed before and expressed it.
Lee was my very close friend. I saw her all the time until she met Jackson. Then I didn't see her for a few weeks. And so then she came and told me she'd met someone she liked very much. And then I told my husband, Herbert, and we invited them to dinner. So later, when they'd left that night, I said, well, how did you like Jackson? Oh, Herbert said, he's a wonderful fellow, a wonderful fellow. I said, well, you didn't seem to have much to say to each other. He said, oh, that's not true. I mean, Jackson said, this is a terrific time to be living, and that gave us enough to think about. Both being very silent people, unless Jackson was drinking, which apparently he wasn't then.
What happened, you see, in the 40s was that and that I think was absolutely essential to the vitality of subsequent art in New York, was that the Europeans, instead of being heard about, actually came to New York and lived here and worked here.
The presence here during the war of the Surrealists, that included Max Ernst, Dali, Henri Masson, and other painters such as Mondrian and Chagall, had to do with the Nazi conquest of France. This made it impossible for some of them politically, for some of them religiously, but for all of them as artists to pursue their careers.
The fact that good European moderns are now here is very important. I'm particularly impressed with their concept of the source of art being the unconscious. When you're painting out of your unconscious, figures are bound to emerge. We're all of us influenced by Freud, I guess. I've been a Jungian for a long time.
I was in a peculiar position. I was involved with the Europeans by virtue of the work I was doing for Peggy Guggenheim in setting up Art of the Century with her. And as the son of Max Ernst, these were all friends of my father's. Once Art of the Century was established, Peggy decided that she would invite young American painters to show their work at a salon that she would have once a year. The jury was to be Alfred H. Barr, James Johnson Sweeney, James Thrall Sobey, Max Ernst, Marcel Duchamp, and Pete Mondrian. As one could expect, Mondrian came at least a half hour early, and we noticed that Mondrian stood rooted to the spot in front of two paintings. And when we came back, he was still standing there. And Peggy went over to him and merely said, "Dreadful, aren't they? They're dreadful. Man has no discipline." And Mondrian paid no attention to her. He just stood there doing this very typical stroking of a non-existing beard. He loved, whenever he was thoughtful or whatever, he would do that. And 10, 15, 20 minutes later, I forget the time span, he was still standing there. And Peggy went back and said, "Come on, there's some other things to be seen." And he said, "No, I'd like to look at this some more." She said, "Why?" I really think it's awful painting, so raw. And Mondrian said, "I don't know about that. I don't know. I have the feeling that I'm looking at some of the most exciting work that I've seen so far in America." And she ripped, "You say this with your kind of painting?" He said, "Just because I paint in a certain way doesn't mean that I expect everyone else to do it. I find there's something worthwhile to look at, and I think it's important." Oh, when the other jurors arrived, Peggy grabbed, I remember she was grabbing Alfred Barr and Jim Sweeney and said, "Come on over here, look at the marvelous discovery we've just made."
New Yorker, 1943. The new show at Art of this Century deserves your attention.
A large painting by Jackson Pollock made the jury starry-eyed.
Things really broke with the showing of that painting. I've been offered a one-man show at the Art of this Century.
And of course, Jackson would have a show coming up, say, in November, and by the end of October, he wouldn't have one single painting for it. And then he would go to work, and in 2 weeks, he would have 20 paintings.
I have a year's contract and a large painting to do for Peggy Guggenheim's house. 8 feet 11.5 inches by 19 feet 9 inches, with no strings as to what or how I paint it. I'm going to paint it in oil on canvas. I've had to tear out the partition between the front and middle room to get the damn thing up. I have it stretched now. It looks pretty big, but it's exciting as all hell.
I met Lee in the hallway, and she said, "You know, the mural is supposed to be delivered tomorrow, and he hasn't started yet." So I went up for a while, and we had coffee, and Jackson was sitting in the studio in front of the canvas. And she said, "I don't dare disturb him, and but I don't know what's going to happen tomorrow." He went to work about, maybe 6 o'clock, and it was finished by dawn.
Bigger than anything Pollock had done. The speed at which he executed this very large picture represented a kind of galvanic quality on the surface that we'd never seen before, that anticipates what came later.
New York, 1944. I'm getting $150 from the gallery, which just about doesn't meet the bills. We are having a hell of a time financially. The Museum of Modern Art bought the painting reproduced in Harper's this week, which I hope will stimulate further sales.
Nation, 1945. Jackson Pollock, the strongest painter of his generation, and perhaps the greatest one to appear since Miro. He is not afraid to look ugly. All profoundly original art looks ugly at first.
There must have been, right from the beginning, although never discussed, a mutual respect, because his ego wouldn't have taken it and mine wouldn't have. So the fact that we were together, I wasn't challenged by it. That's not the feeling I had. I was very exhilarated. He was terrific, you know? And I didn't threaten him, or we would have seen signs of all this happening. And then after living together, some 3 years, I'd say roughly, I decided I wanted marriage, although I'd been absolutely against it, so I gave him the ultimatum: either we get married or split. And he sat with that one for a while, and he said, marriage, but I want a church wedding, and you find the church. So I was left with doing that, which was a bit of a problem, as I'm Jewish and he was unbaptized Presbyterian. And to find a little church wasn't easy that would marry us, but that was accomplished and we were married.
East Hampton, Long Island. Lee and I came out here to get away from the wear and tear.
Well, when we first moved out in 45, it was, let's see, how can I describe it? I don't know how to describe it. It was hell, to put it mildly, for me. Because, for instance, it was during the war period, so that you couldn't get a supply of fuel. Cold water, no hot water, no bathroom. No, it was a rough scene. It isn't like most artists know today.
I had an underneath confidence that I could begin to live on my painting. Also, somebody had bought one of my pictures. We lived a year on that picture, and a few clams I dug out of the bay with my toes.
In the autumn of 1946, Pollock began these all-over pictures like shimmering substance, which were not yet poured, but often done with spatulas, with the finger.
When he came out to East Hampton, he quit drinking completely. And from then on, for a few years, it was a completely peaceful life he had, you know. It was quite nice.
I'm having the barn moved next week. The grass has overrun the place. The country is wonderful. It's marvelous the way Lee's adjusted herself. She's always up by 9, 10 at the latest. P.S. Have a boat and a goat.
We went for a walk on the beach down Gatsett, and it was November, and the weather had closed in, and suddenly Jackson, he said, "John, I dare you to go swimming." And of course the waves were heavy, they were coming in, and I remembered, I thought, well, this might be risky, but I said, "You don't dare me," and I started taking my clothes off, and he took his clothes off. Lee was way up the beach, and so I jumped in, and he then had to jump in to carry through his bluff.
And he would drive with that same feeling. He would drive dangerously. He would do everything with a kind of a zest of seeing how much he could get out of it. He would go through a period when he was using a bow and arrow, and he would suddenly come in. You'd be going to visit him or something, and he'd say, "Let's shoot the arrow," and he wanted to do it right in the room, next to his paintings, next to his work, to the windows.
I hardly ever stretch my canvas before painting. I prefer to tack the unstretched canvas to the hard wall or the floor. On the floor, I'm more at ease. I feel nearer, more part of the painting, since this way I can walk around it, work from the four sides, and literally be in the painting. I continue to get further away from the usual painter's tools, such as easel, palette, brushes. I prefer sticks, trowels, knives, and dripping fluid paint.
Pollock was basically a draftsman. He drew by pouring paint. He didn't dribble it or drip it. And Pollock had incredible control over this pouring.
If you put paint on a brush, you can only go so far and then it stops and it gets smudgy. So to keep this line flowing, this pure quality of defining a space, he found a new technique. And that's how most, would say, art forms are born. They're born out of when someone is looking for something very badly, he finds a way of doing it, and that becomes his art form. And so that was what we have in Jackson.
He had a beautiful roll of canvas, and he suddenly decided to take it out, and he took it and he spread it out on the floor of the living room, which filled the living room, and he went and got paint, and he took the tubes, and he started to paint. He would just make the most precise lines right from the tube, squeezing it out. It would be thick but very narrow and precise. But he was in a sort of trance as he worked. And then after a while, his hands were by then quite covered with paint. He knelt down in the middle of the painting and sort of caressed it with his hands, which had purple all over them. So made handprints. That was when I watched him paint. It's the only time.
Most people thought of Pollock as a completely new meteoric painter who came out of nowhere. But in fact, like all truly great painting, Pollock's painting had a great debt to the past.
He was facing the history of art behind him, that's all. No slouchy problem. He was facing Picasso.
Picasso represented for Pollock the furthest out thing that art could be. Very often Pollock did something, saw Picasso later and would exclaim, "Damn it, that guy got there first." You know, that he felt himself in constant competition, as if he were in a kind of combat with Picasso. And I think that Pollock learned a great deal from Picasso in this combat, and that in 1946-47, when he began the great word pictures, he really went beyond Picasso.
On the one hand, he knew how great a painter he was. On the other hand, he was as filled with doubt. You know, when he'd call me in and say, is this a painting? Not a good one or a bad one. Is it a painting? And that would probably be one of the things where another phase where he had changed again. And I thought, he's mad, you know, not to see what's there. On the other hand, he knew exactly how good he was. So both were true. I knew this about him.
Lee Krasner was a vanguard mentality probably before Pollock was himself. And so instead of trying to keep him back, she certainly encouraged the things he did which were, in a sense, farthest out. And I think that Pollock was very fortunate to have someone that was urging him on rather than keeping him back. Bill de Kooning said once that Pollock broke the ice, and this remark has been much quoted. Certainly he was referring to the radicality of Pollock's having invented this new pouring technique, but I think it was as much, if not more, directed toward the fact that Pollock was the first painter among vanguard painters to get widespread public attention, and that in that sense he broke the ice on a public level for the whole generation.
There was a reviewer a while back who wrote that my pictures didn't have any beginning or any end. He didn't mean it as a compliment, but it was. Only he didn't know it.
New York World Telegram, 1949. Most of Jackson Pollock's paintings resemble a mop of tangled hair I have an irresistible urge to comb out.
Time Magazine, 1949. A Jackson Pollock painting is apt to resemble a child's contour map of the Battle of Gettysburg.
Vogue magazine. Irene answers the short skirts are long question both ways in this spring ball gown of souffle de soie and ostrich feathers. Jackson Pollock's abstractions in the backgrounds.
1949. Jackson Pollock. Is he the greatest living painter in the United States?
Chaos, damn it. Jackson Pollock's abstractions stump experts as well as laymen. Each one of his pictures is part of himself. But what kind of man is he?
Telegram to Time Magazine. No chaos, damn it. Damn busy painting, as you can see by my show coming up.
I think the 1950 show was different from all others because it contained the first truly wall-sized pictures that Pollock had painted since the Peggy Guggenheim mural. The painter Fritz Bultmann once said to me it was like being in a cathedral.
into that room and not get some sort of a sense of what it was about. Don't forget various artists were responding, people like Clifford Still, Barney Newman, Mark Rothko. He must have picked up what that show meant.
I found New York terribly depressing after my show, and nearly impossible. I really hit an all-time low with depression and drinking. Last year, I thought at last I'm above water from now on in. But things don't work out that easily, I guess.
And he wasn't always the simplest person to live with. I was very aware of that. And when I bring it up, because I was losing patience, the only thing he'd ever say to me is, he never said it wasn't so, nor did he say, I'll stop it, you know. He'd say, think of it as a storm, it'll go by. In a painterly sense, I know what he was confronting, but his innermost struggle, I never knew outright. That if there was a struggle, there's no question about it. For instance, he was alcoholic and battling that damn scene. He wasn't pretending it didn't exist.
(1951). I've had a period of drawing on canvas in black, with some of my early images coming through. I think the non-objectivists will find them disturbing, and the kids who think it's simple to splash a Pollock out.
Well, I think that the despair that Jackson had was similar to the despair that many other artists have had through history and contemporarily with him. Only that in his case, it was like from his boyhood. It was something that haunted him, and his shyness, he wanted to cover it up with rudeness. I remember once he said to me, I feel like an oyster without a shell.
I spoke to him about seeing the Beckett play, Waiting for Godot, and I raved about it. It was such a new experience, a wonderful thing to see, that I instilled a desire in him to go see it. And he did go to see it. And when he came back from the theater, he said, I had to walk out on it. He couldn't take it, he said. It was so intense and real for him.
The champ, Jackson Pollock at 43. The heavyweight champion of abstract expression, shuffled into the ring at Manhattan's Sidney Janis Gallery.
Looking for beauty or worrying about what socially relevant message is being communicated.
Too much of an air of baked macaroni about some of his patterns. Turgid, sporadically vital reelings as if the artist had been playing with paint and got carried away.
Well, the fame that came to Jackson at that time, you might call it more notoriety. It was a kind of singling him out as some kind of a freak.
Jack the Dripper, as Time magazine called him, and so forth. Pollock, the tough guy, the murderer of art. All of this makes wonderful copy. And I think that the news media attach themselves much more to the personality, the man, and the technique than to any concern for the quality and character of the art itself.
What is the public image? Is that of a wild man? Is that of an alcoholic or a person that you'd want to stay away from? I would say he was desperate. He was questioning himself as well as the art he did and everything he stood for.
I think a public image was a very natural one for the public to have because he was a sensational man particularly when he drank. He went rather wild and did strange things. And so he was a man to avoid. I avoided him if I could at those times.
If you said the wrong thing to him, he might get violent.
So he would come in a rather dramatic way, and I always visualized him as having two pistols, like a cowboy coming in and disrupting the whole place. And he would go up to someone like Franz or Bill and say, "You fucking whore, you think you're a painter?"
By 1953 and 4, we could really say Pollock's art is in crisis. He made pictures which were very problematic, and I think he recognized them as such.
I knew he wasn't painting, and I knew the pressure on him, and knew that people were waiting for paintings, and that I could imagine would be a most dreadful situation to be in.
And though he came back late at night, he came in a rage, saying that, "What do they want from me? What do they want? I've already done it."
In my opinion, he was just going through a bad period. And that if it had been left alone, and if the tragedy hadn't happened, he might have picked up and gone off to other paintings.
There was, there's no question about it. When he was like that and got into the car, I feared an accident.
On August 11th, 1956, Patrolman Earl Finch received a radio dispatch from town police headquarters reporting an automobile accident on the Springs Fireplace Road.
Investigation report. Proceeded to the scene arriving at 22:20 hours and found a 1950 Oldsmobile convertible operated by owner Jackson Pollock. Observed an injured woman who was removed to hospital, a male body and a female body. Removed bodies to funeral home. Vehicle apparently traveling at a high rate of speed while rounding a curve went off the road. Operator losing control. Vehicle skidded, collided with two small trees, pivoted, reversed its direction and turned end over end backwards, coming to rest upside down. Accident, suicide, or homicide? Specify. Accident.
It seems to me that the modern painter cannot express this age, the airplane, the atom bomb, the radio, in the old forms of the Renaissance or any other past culture. Each age finds its own technique.
Introspection is indispensable to the artist. In our next program, we'll see how two artists, Arshil Gorky and Franz Klein, expressed their inner visions on canvas in very different ways.
This program is made possible by grants from ARCO, Atlantic Richfield Company, putting our energy into America, and by the Masco Corporation.